Your foot position on the leg press will not influence the involvement of the hamstrings in that movement.
G'day guys, it's Daniel from Club Aquarius. Let's go over some common misconceptions and two main movements that you need for your hamstrings.
The first movement that you may have done before, which is an absolute hamstring staple, is the leg curl. First thing I'll do is make sure the knee pad is firmly locking my quads into place so my hips will not lift up while performing the movement. From there, we simply focus on flexing the knee while keeping our hips as locked into place as possible. I'm aiming for a full range of motion here, fully extending my knee straight at the top of the movement and flexing my knee as much as I can at the bottom of the movement. As you can see here, one of our hamstrings functions is knee flexion, but most importantly, whilst our hips are in a fixed position. More on that later. Variation of the leg curl you may or may not have witnessed before is where you sit more upright or even slightly lean forward to increase the flexion of your hips, which increases the stretch that you feel in your hamstrings. This is based on some evidence that increasing the tension on muscles in a more stretched position is beneficial for muscle growth, such as this study here, which compared long-length hamstring training to short-length hamstring training.
There is one thing that needs to remain constant with any hamstring variation. The hamstring attaches to both the hip and the knee joint, explaining why when we do a knee flexion movement, the hip needs to remain in a fixed position. In other words, if both the hip and the knees are moving, the hamstring will not be effectively contracting. Whilst doing a leg curl with a slight lean forward might increase hip flexion and be more beneficial, it will not be as beneficial if our hips are moving too far forward during the movement, as we are actually decreasing the length of contraction in the hamstrings. But with all that being said, the most important factor when it comes to muscle growth is always going to be your training intensity. So regardless of what variation of leg curl you're doing, ensure to focus solely on knee flexion and attempt to progressively overload that preferred variation over time. Now moving on to the other variation you will need to effectively train the hamstrings, which is some form of hip hinge. In this movement, you'll see me set up with my feet directly underneath my hips and begin with stiffened knees so we can lift the bar solely through hip extension. Remembering the hamstrings attach to the hip and knees but can only be trained when one joint is fixed while the other is moving. So in this case, contrary to the leg curl we did earlier, the knees are locked into place, and as we can see, the other function of our hamstrings is hip extension, or otherwise known as pushing the hip joint behind their resting position. So the spinal erectors play a role in spinal extension, or otherwise known as going from a flexed, bent over position to a straight flexed position, so they will play a role in this movement as well. Go over the form of this movement as it can be quite tricky to learn at the beginning. I refer to this movement as a stiff leg deadlift, as my main goal is to keep my knees as still as possible during the movement and thinking about driving my hips back as much as I can until the bar pretty much hits the floor. Then repeating the upwards motion of the lift whilst keeping the knees still. You'll also need to ensure a straight back position is maintained during the movement. I always start by retracting my shoulders back and down and bracing my shoulders in that position as I pick up the bar. This will ensure that my upper back does not round as we pick up the bar. We do not want our back looking like this during the movement. So using what we now know, we can clearly see why having a high foot position on the leg press actually has no influence of the hamstrings during a leg press. For starters, the concentric part of the movement, or otherwise known as when the muscles are contracting, is during knee extension, and we now know the hamstrings are involved in knee flexion, not extension, explaining why the leg press is beneficial for the quadriceps. But the other important thing to remember is both the hip and the knee flexing during this movement, so the hamstrings are not effectively lengthening or shortening during the movement anyway, which is what happens during a muscle contraction. At best, the hamstrings are a stabilizing muscle in the leg press, but not a contracting one. So next time someone explains to you that they use a high foot position on the leg press just to train the hamstrings, just smile and nod politely, knowing that we now know better. If we have any questions about these exercises or would like to go over the technique more practically, come and see me at Redcliffe's Club Aquarius or 15th Club Aquarius and book in for a program.